Hello, and welcome to today's Fragmentarium video conference. Today, my guest is Dr. Eric Johnson, professor and curator of Thompson Special Collections, The Ohio State University. He'll be speaking today on Deathless Fragments, a virtual tour of the current exhibit at the Thompson Library. Eric, you have the floor.
All right, thank you very much. Bear with me a second as I make sure I don't destroy the internet by attempting to share things. So thanks everyone. I'm really excited to have you all here to go through virtually this exhibit with me. It's been an exhibit that's been on my mind for well over a decade. I don't think I could have done it any earlier than I did because it's taken a lot of time for all of these stories to percolate in my head. But what I wanted to mention, folks, we're not going to do any sort of video component to this. It's too clunky. So I have set up everything in a PowerPoint presentation that'll take you through with some still shots, highlighting certain individual items, but then taking you case by case through the exhibit. Last week, I just recorded like a 3.5 silent, no commentary walkthrough of the gallery so that you can just get a sense of the spatial arrangement of things in there. But also here's some still shots just to show you. This is as you walk into the main gallery at Thompson Library, showing you the opening cases and the opening placard. One of the other corner views of the room. Third view, just taking you through all the corners with panoramic shots of the space. And the final view. So without further ado, I'll get to what we've got here. This is case one, just as kind of a standard introductory case. For those of you who know me, I very much self-identify as a fragmentologist within the manuscript studies community. I love pretty much everything about medieval manuscripts, but I found fragments incredibly fascinating. And this really began when I started here at Ohio State. I was an assistant professor. I was put in charge of the early books and manuscripts collection. And in order to get tenure, one needs to have a sustainable research agenda. For those of you who are faculty members who work within an academic library setting in the United States, at least, you may know we don't have 9-month contracts. We have 12-month contracts. So we are first and foremost librarians, and then we squeeze in that research time around our professional duties. So for me, it was very, very key early on in trying to think about what I was going to do to come up with something that could be locally supportable and some local resources that could help me formulate kind of an interesting research agenda. I was lucky to walk into a position here, unbeknownst to me at the time that I started, where OSU had a very sizable collection of manuscript fragments. And I'll talk more about that when we get to the Bruce Ferrini component of the exhibit. But we basically had about 650 to 670 fragments, representing a total of about 90 different codices, or leaves from a total of about 90 different codices. And I started pouring through all of this stuff very early in my time, thinking, oh, there's going to be potential here. I wound up focusing on one particular manuscript, which we'll talk about a little bit more. But over the years, I've been deploying this stuff not just in my own research, but extremely heavily in our very user-focused outreach program and curricular programming here at OSU. And over the course of time, that collection has grown from the initial roughly 650 manuscripts from 90 codices to, as of yesterday, 1,438 fragments, representing a total of 468 different codices in the collection. It's been a very interesting experience of auction and retail purchasing, as well as donor development and donor contributions. There's a lot that one can discuss about the ethics of fragment collecting in relations to an exhibition like that, but that's not what we're going to do today. For those of you who are interested, 3 years ago now, I organized and chaired a panel discussion for Rare Book School on the ethics of fragment collecting. Many of you were likely at that and attended or viewed it since then, but if you want to learn more about kind of standards and thinking about ethics, have a look at that when you can. So the introductory case really needed to kind of come up, for me, the first case of an exhibition is always the most difficult. What are you going to encapsulate in that case that's going to speak to the widest body of people who are coming to your show? And while we're on the center, or in the main university library and at the absolute center of campus, a huge component of the people who are coming in here are not the folks attending this talk today. They're school children, they're undergraduates who are STEM majors, have no knowledge whatsoever about the humanities for the most part, much less medieval manuscripts. So what goes in this intro case and how does it best encapsulate the entirety of the exhibit? So what I threw into this case are a trio of complete medieval manuscripts. You can see those displayed to various openings just to give folks a sense of what an intact medieval book looks like, give them a starting point for that. And then I wanted to talk to them a little bit about what I call the two families of fragmentation, licit fragmentation and illicit fragmentation. So flanking things in this case, you're going to see on the left, 2 fragments, on the right, 2 other fragments. I've got it parsed here. On the left, we have examples of licit or permissible fragmentation. This isn't so much a qualifier for how these were originally broken, but more like what kind of warning signals we need to think about in terms of building collections today. So licit fragmentation for me are those things, they're fragments that are products of deep historical time and accident. It might be fragmentation from the overuse of a book, a deliberate destruction of the book in something, for instance, like the dissolution of the monasteries in England, which is so far back, there's nothing we can do about it. And the detritus of those deliberate breakings has just proliferated across the world in the centuries since then. The recycling of fragments that have been broken down for whatever purposes and reinstituted into book bindings, or dress forms, or shoe patterns, or saddles, or however they've been recycled. So on the left, we've got a couple examples of what I term licit fragmentation. Both of these, in each case, we've got the Prosper of Aquitaine fragment at the top, the Adam of Aldersbach fragment at the bottom. These were things that were recycled within the context of book bindings. On the right, then, we have what becomes really the major family that is explored in the rest of Deathless Fragments, or the majority of Deathless Fragments, which is that illicit fragmentation, or the deliberate breaking of manuscripts for the dispersal of leaves as artistic objects for commercial profit. And so we have a couple examples there. On the bottom is an illuminated book of ours. We recently acquired that maybe 3 years ago. The one on the top, this beautiful early 16th century missal with a funeral scene, that was donated to us last June, so June 2023, by a donor in Philadelphia, giving us about $150,000 worth of illuminated manuscript fragments. So that kind of provides the intro. And then I also wanted to kind of give people a sense of different types of manuscript fragmentation. And this is by far kind of the oddest thing in the exhibit. This is a private loan that is here for us. It belongs to a private collection here in Ohio. And this is actually a very small strip of parchment, as you can see, with a non-syntactical textual unit on it. It's not complete here, but it's in French. This is a 15th century thing where the parchment that's been written on has been pasted to what is the proximal phalanx, or the finger bone just past the knuckle on a human. And I love this example because there is no name on this. There is no like full syntactical unit, as I said, and it immediately suggests that this is a relic fragment of a larger finger, a hand, a complete arm, perhaps even a skeleton that was completely covered at one point in manuscript and has now been fragmented as well. So I wanted to throw that in there as kind of a conversation starter, especially with the high school students who've been coming in, to get them thinking about, you know, what is a manuscript? What is a book? I also really like how these bones have been, or this bone has been refleshed, so to speak, with animal parchment and writing. So that gives the main context for the intro. And we then move on to the next case, case 2, which is just examples of licit fragmentation of different types. So you can see here a whole range of things, from spine liners to paste downs to book covers. Over towards the center right next to the open book is a 13th century Latin missal from Germany that was folded up, backed with 18th century paper at some point and turned into a document folder. So I've tried to do things like provide people with paired examples here. So we have a book with a hole in the spine that is showing spine liners in situ. But then we've got a binding fragment that has long been excised from whatever book it was in, that shows what these spine liners often look like as structural units. Similar one, paste downs. We've got on the left a loose paste down. You can see the leather staining, the tanning staining from where it had been in touch with the book's leather covers at one point. from a German missal. And then we've got this Catalogus Sanctorum, this early printed book, 1506 edition, with a Justinian's Civil Institutes fragment used as an in situ paste down in this case. And then book covers. We've got this 13th century Psalter that's clearly seen its better days, nice and soiled, but we've got the external surface of a book cover here. And then on the right, one of my favorite items in the entirety of OSU's collection is this 1554 Latin edition of what effectively is the first edition of John Fox's Acts and Monuments, one of the core English Protestant texts of the 16th century. And it's been wrapped in a fragment of an Atlantic Bible. This is from the Book of Judith. And this is really evocative for me because we have kind of a relic of the old church, so to speak, the Roman church, that's been deliberately destroyed and is now packaging and preserving a piece of kind of the new church, the Protestant church in England. I don't know if the manuscript that this is bound in was once part of an English monastic library, but it's kind of fun to think that maybe it was, and we're seeing kind of a preservation of the old along with the new within the English ecclesiastical context in the 16th century. I think my favorite item in this case, though, is this priest's bequest book. Basically, it's from a parish church and in a town called Grisalenia, up near Burgos in northern Spain, not too far from kind of the Camino Frances on the Camino de Santiago. And this is a record book that records gifts of wax, wine, cash, all sorts of things by parishioners to secure votive masses for the souls of dead relatives. And this page on the right is a very early fragmentation and then reconstitution. The sewing that has put this page back together is not new. When I first saw this, I wasn't quite sure what was going on here, but I ran it past folks because I had a suspicion about what this was. And I contacted maybe half a dozen clothing historians, medieval clothing historians, and ran this idea past them. And I wondered if these were perhaps cut into shoe form shapes for heels and toes for shoes for use by a cobbler. And we don't know for sure that that's what happened, but all of the clothing historians that I've contacted seem to think that this is probably what happened with this. And it aligns with a lot of fragments that we do know of that have been in situ in some actual surviving medieval clothes and shoes, things like that. So I really like this Frankenstein page. So these are various examples of that licit fragmentation that get the conversation started when I've got students coming into this exhibition. And I should say I'm very happy that this exhibition gallery has really turned into a popular classroom since its opening in March. So we've been getting a lot of active use and conversation because of that. So from the licit fragmentation, I really want to turn to what the rest of the exhibit is about, which is that illicit fragmentation, the deliberate breaking of books for commercial profit. And this is where things really shift to kind of the subsidiary theme of this exhibit, which is the very specific part that the state of Ohio has played in the breaking of medieval books and their distribution, not just across North America, but all over the world. And you really cannot tell that story of illicit fragmentation and Ohio and North America without mentioning Otto Ege. So Ege is the first case here, and I'm sure everyone in this attending this is familiar with who Otto Ege is, but just on the off chance there isn't, he was a Cleveland art educator who collected manuscripts from really the 1920s until his death in 1951. At some point, he cottoned onto this, in quotes, brilliant idea to break apart books and distribute their pages to anyone who might be interested in it. He was a self-avowed biblioclast, and in an article he wrote stating this fact and defending his practice, his line basically was that very few people can afford to own a complete medieval manuscript. However, many more people could actually afford to own a single leaf. So that was his justification, like get this out to the masses, increase in appreciation for all of this, and provide libraries, schools. This would include universities, colleges, high schools, and anyone in the general public with teachable samples of medieval book culture. Now, he liked to characterize himself very much as this educational advocate. However, let's not beat around the bush here. He made a lot of money doing this too. And he had all sorts of business relationships across North America with book dealers like Philip C. Dushne's, with Dawson's Books out in LA, with Brentano's. He was buying, he was selling through various dealers, but then on top of that, he forged some very interesting relationships with art museums, with public libraries, and other folks to distribute his manuscript pages. We'll turn to that in a second. One thing I want to draw attention to here is there's a wealth of material one could include in an Otto Ege case or an Otto Ege, Ege exhibit. But I threw in the bottom left corner here, you'll see the famous Beauvais missile. I wanted to include kind of hot links, or excuse me, QR codes, I should say, throughout this exhibit so that people could see various examples of how fragments are being reconstituted within the digital environment or within scholarly articles and things like that. So we've got a QR code that will take viewers straight to Lisa's reconstruction of the Beauvais missile as a model of what can be done to undo a lot of the damage that we see here. So materials that I included in this case include a very famous trio of Italian humanist manuscripts. We've got the Cicero, the Terence, and the Livy manuscripts. We've got the so-called Cambridge Bible up in the top right corner there. And then that large coral bifolium there, I've always found very, very interesting. The illumination in it is not medieval. If you could see it up close, you would know this immediately. It's most likely 19th century, but it's an interesting bifolium. And then on the left is Scott Guara's 2013 book on Otto Ege. You really can't do anything in this field without looking at that book. And I'm sure we're all eagerly awaiting that second edition from Notre Dame Press coming out supposedly next year, I think. And then just close-up portrait for Otto, a very familiar one for most of us, but just so people know what he looks like. And then a random sampling of some of the many, the dozens and dozens and dozens of manuscripts that Ege fragmented. So sticking with the Ege theme, but kind of exploring some of his partnerships, another case in the exhibit focuses on the Lima Public Library here in Northwest Ohio and the SLFA, the Staff Loan Fund Assistance Program. So Lima Public Library, this is commonly known. They were a very big partner with Otto Ege. They began their partnership with him in 1930 when Georgie McAfee, the librarian at Lima Public, contacted him asking him to come and give a talk on illuminated manuscripts at the library, and then would he also by any chance be interested in bringing fragments with him that the library could sell on commission for him. Ege agreed to do this, but was very skeptical about how successful the sale would be. And in surviving correspondence at Lima, Otto responds to Georgie saying, "I'd be happy to do this. I think you're going to be lucky if you sell $25 worth of manuscripts." So they have the event, and at that event, Lima Public sells 87 manuscript fragments for the equivalent of what today would be just under $10,000 worth of fragments. So this was in the vicinity of $600 at that point. So Ege saw the real value. He's like, oh, I think these people could make me some money. What wound up happening is Ege kept 75% of the sales. Lima Public kept 25% and used it to fund their Staff Loan Fund Assistance Program, which basically was a product of Georgie's devisings to help offset some of the economic hardship that her librarians were undergoing at the beginning of the Depression. The money was in place, and the Lima staff members, the library staff members, were able to apply for what were effectively short-term loans to support professional development, educational expenses, etc. Over the course of the life of the SLFA, this fund wound up getting used very creatively, though. Manuscripts sold via Lima Public Library, in a very real sense, bought groceries, paid for vacations, provided down payments for cars, all sorts of personal expenses, not just educational and professional development. So what's really interesting about this case, though, is it's showing a bunch of things that only came to light a little over a year ago. I was on a trip up to Lima to teach at the OSU regional campus there. And while there, I had arranged with Gary Frazier, the librarian at Lima Public Library, to come back with the 76 manuscript leaves that Lima Public owned, along with a small clutch of 3 or 4 folders of archival correspondence that scholarship has known about for quite some time. I packed up all this stuff with the intent of bringing it to Ohio State to inventory, to digitize, to assess for preservation needs, etc. We were packing up the van that I had, And as I was leaving, I asked Gary if they had any more documentation, any more manuscripts, anything else that maybe no one had seen. And he looked at me and said, nope, I did a really thorough dive. You've got everything. So I was going, okay, that's great. Thanks for your time. I'm about to close the door to the van, and he comes up and he jingles his keys at me. And he says, I've got a meeting, but if you want, you can head down to the basement and just look around the storage areas, see if you can find anything. You never say no to invites like this. So I went down to the basement, started cracking file cabinets, and that black binder that's at the top center of the image you're seeing here was the first thing I found. It was in a drawer, sitting spine up, blank black spine, but then written across it in white. It just said manuscripts. So this piques my interest, obviously. I take it out, and what it winds up being is our first itemized annotated stock list that has ever come to light about the Lima business operation. So the printed material that you're seeing here is a very well-known and widely distributed, widely known catalog, basically, of the leaves that Lima Public was selling on Otto's behalf. All of the added notes, though, that's the important part. For the first time, it is giving us very distinct and specific inventory code numbers, and the code system that Lima Public used to inventory all their manuscripts. It's giving prices and it's giving us dates of sale. So that was very exciting. I continue to pull the drawer out, and the stuff that you're seeing in the bottom center here underneath that larger thing, that emerged next. And this is a series of ledger books. Now, this really got me excited because when Scott Guara published his book, and based on the state of what we knew with the archival survivals at Lima that everyone knew about, the Lima library relationship with the Eges, with Otto, stops in 1951 when he dies, but the library continued dealing with his widow, Louise, up until about 1957. So we knew that this business arrangement lasted from November 1930 until sometime in 1957, resulting in the sale of roughly 2,000 to 2,500 fragments via Lima. The ledger books, however, were immediately interesting because they preserved sales not up to 1957, but to February 1976. So the library continued selling manuscripts for another 20 years or so after what we originally thought that trade ended. The ledger books are exceptional because they record the name, address of every buyer, the inventory number, a brief description of every fragment, and then the price for every fragment, giving us a comprehensive kind of first stop for every Ege fragment that Lima Public Library sold. Moreover, in addition to extending our knowledge about the temporal extent of Lima Library's selling activities, we also have a much firmer, though still indeterminate, precise number of leaves that they sold. Altogether, they sold somewhere between 4,200 and 4,600 manuscript and early printed book fragments, the majority of them being manuscript fragments over the course of that 46-year history. So this gives you kind of a little close-up of one of the things here. So the person's address is on the back there. All of these inventory numbers can then be linked up to the inventory numbers that we see in this kind of book. And then on the left, I just wanted to show an example. The fragment depicted there is one of the rare binding fragments, or former binding fragments that Ege sold. This is from Peter Lombard's Sentences with the standard gloss of St. Bonaventure around it. When I acquired this last year down in the southeast of the US, it actually came with its original mat, and thankfully it had an inventory number with it. So I've created an electronic data set that transcribes all of the ledger book data, and then I've gone through, and in every possible case, I've provided either confirmed or best guess Ege hand list number associations for every inventory item that you see here. And plugging in that inventory item, I was able to determine that it was purchased in 1945 by a high school physics teacher named Otto Ege in Council Bluffs, Iowa, along with a couple dozen other leaves that he bought. Since then, I've found another 7 of the leaves that Bump bought in the same transaction. I found in other institutional and private collections. So this is really interesting. I mean, it only tells us so much. We don't know how it got from Bump to the person that supplied it to Ohio State, but it does give provenance researchers that crucial first step in some ways to start following some of these chains. So moving on from Lima and Ege, we get to the other really big Ohio book breaker, and that is Bruce Ferrini. I mentioned at the beginning of this talk that we had 650 leaves roughly when I arrived here at Ohio State and started my job. The vast majority of these are the product of Ferrini breakings. Ferrini worked with a small family network of donors at Ohio State to deliberately purchase books and break them apart to sell pieces on the market, and then to donate the less marketable pieces for tax credit to Ohio State. Not particularly a great thing to do. However, it has left me with a research agenda, so there's only so far I can complain, I suppose. But this Ferrini case shows a range of things that he broke. Not all were things that were donated originally to OSU during that 1980 to 1986 period. But this will give you a sense of the range of what he broke and what we've got, from illuminated pocket Bibles to extremely deluxe illuminated books of hours, a really fantastic copy of a mid-12th century, third quarter of the 12th century copy of Gregory the Great's 40 Homilies on the Gospels, the famous Hildesheim prayer book from roughly 1524, I think the date that's been ascribed to it. Up in the top right corner, a really gorgeous French Psalter, illuminated French Psalter that ostensibly was produced for a nun's use. I know Peter Kidd has written quite a bit about this in his blog. He's also addressed the Hildesheim prayer book, so you can find a lot more information about those manuscripts on his Manuscripts Provenance blog. But Ferrini is a major force in American book breaking and the distribution and dispersal of manuscripts. Most of you may be familiar with this picture already, but it's just a classic. Here's Ferrini like Scrooge McDuck, the famous Disney character in his money pit, swimming around with a bunch of fragments. Not all of these were his breakings. You can see up at the top left a Beauvais missal leaf. So he dabbled in selling Ege fragments and really anything that came his way. But I've got this captioned as Ferrini amidst some of his many fragments, and then parenthetically, and soon to be fragments, because I want to draw your attention to the book he's holding in his right hand, which is a 19th century illuminated manuscript. And it's a really, really nice one, pieces of which are now in London. I've even seen a leaf of this in a Northern Ohio private collection. So things that were intact in this photograph are not intact anymore. So unlike Ege, and Ege did make money distributing his leaves, but unlike Ege, Ferrini really didn't have, from all of the interviews I've done with former business partners and former clients, Ferrini's push was really not educationally motivated. It was entirely profit driven. And boy, did he make a profit. And this is my best case for the profit that can be made from book breaking activities of Ferrini's type. And this was the thing that really caught my attention at Ohio State when I was looking for my first major research project. And this is the so-called Hornby Cockerell Bible. So you see a bunch of fragments on the wall, a bunch of fragments in the case here. The Bible in the middle has nothing to do with this manuscript other than being an example of a complete 13th century illuminated Bible that's in our collection that just gives people a context for what Hornby may have looked like as an intact piece. So the Hornby Cockerell Bible is a first quarter of the 13th century illuminated Bible from Paris or northwestern France, deliberately purchased and broken by Ferrini and two business associates in September 1981. On the left of the intact Bible in that case, you'll see Ferrini's own copy of the auction catalog, the Christie's catalog from September 81, listing this for sale. It's marked up, it's annotated. Crucially, for my purposes, the title page, which isn't displayed here, Ferrini wrote, or one of his agents wrote on that title page, Stillman Hall, OSU, Ohio State University. Now, notably, at that point in time, Stillman Hall was the headquarters of the university's donor development program. So they immediately, going into this sale, had OSU targeted as a destination point for this manuscript, possibly for other things that they had targeted in this sale. So Ferrini buys this in September 81, takes possession of it, gets it back to Akron, and immediately cuts it apart. I've interviewed his former business associate on this, Dr. Michael Greenberg, about this process. And Dr. Greenberg told me within a week he had flown out from his place in Chicago to visit Ferrini and Akron. And his quote to me, it's staggeringly chilling. We sat at his kitchen counter and divided up the leaves like they were pieces of candy at Halloween. And he mimicked how Ferrini would say, "I'll take a St. Paul, you can have a Judith. I'll take a St. Luke, you can have St. Mark." And they just distributed the manuscripts willy-nilly that way. And then Ferrini immediately starts selling his cut of the manuscript, while Greenberg and Philip Sills, his uncle, start selling. They keep some for themselves. They start selling other pages on the open market. And then the lion's share of what they've got in terms of the text-only leaves wind up being deposited at Ohio State. So this is where things get interesting. They bought the manuscript for the equivalent of, or excuse me, not the equivalent of, back then it was $23,100, or roughly $60,000 to $65,000 today. When they purchased it, they cut it apart, immediately start selling, and the illuminated leaves, like this, Ferrini immediately starts selling for about $6,500 a page. You can get different kinds of appraised values for them today, but back in the 1980s, this is roughly what he was selling each of these leaves for. The text-only leaves that were deposited in January 1982 at Ohio State were ultimately donated to the university in November of 1982. And for that donation process, they needed a formal appraisal. And this is where things get a little hinky because the donors contracted Ferrini to actually provide the appraisal. So Ferrini appraised those at anywhere between $400 and $500 a leaf. So if you take Ferrini's sales prices for the illuminated leaves and you take his appraised values for the text-only leaves, you have a $23,100 manuscript that, based on his prices and valuations, if you bought it page by page in the 1980s, not long after you broke it, it would have cost close to $900,000 to purchase on a leaf-by-leaf basis. I won't bore you with everything I could say about this manuscript because it has been the focus of my research for a long time, but if you're really interested in the story about this Bible, not just its provenance history and its history of breaking, but also speculations based on the roughly 250 leaves that I've seen or been able to identify or that have been brought to my attention. Information about what exactly was lost by this breaking. And this is a truly tragic loss for those of us interested in the history and the evolution of the Bible in the first third of the 13th century. This is one of those rare examples of what's called a transitional Bible, and it's transitional in every possible sense, in terms of textual organization, the evolution and the adaptation of chapter numbering system in the 13th century for the Bible, evolution in the iconography of the Bible, illumination styles, all sorts of things. So the article addresses that stuff. And then it also speculates on possibilities for its medieval use based on the few folios that have survived and that I've found so far that bear reader added annotations and evidence. So just to give you a sense of some of the things that were cut out of this, these are not clippings or cuttings. These are just detail shots of intact leaves, just to be clear. But an absolutely beautiful manuscript that Ferrini destroyed. But you can see by that $23,000 to $900,000 difference in an intact book and its sale price and the potential sale price total for individual leaves, what that motivation was. So none of what I'm about to show you next is in the exhibit, but I just want to give you a sense of Ferrini's legacy to book breaking, but also Ferrini's legacy to Ohio State. These are all little packages of fragments that Ferrini broke with various business partners and leaves that were then donated almost immediately to Ohio State after their breaking in the 1980s. So this is the famous Icon Psalter. Peter Kidd's recently written a blog on this based on a leaf that appeared in an auction I believe it was last year, the Colker sale maybe. I'm not sure if it was the Colker sale. Peter can tell us. If you want to learn about this as well, there's another article Scott Guara and I wrote called The Butcher's Bill that is a series of 6 case studies. This is one of them that talks about kind of the motivation, the fiscal motivation behind book breaking, what's lost by that book breaking, and how the Schoenberg database for manuscripts can be a crucial tool in helping us reconstruct manuscripts. So we've got the Eichen Psalter. We've got another one of my favorite manuscripts at Ohio State. This is a clutch of fragments from circa 1230 English Scholars Bible produced either in London or Oxford. Martin Skoyen has done a fantastic job in corralling the majority of this manuscript. He has over 200 folios of it, thankfully. But this is a monumentally significant manuscript, in my opinion. It is a very, very interesting transitional piece. I'd be happy to talk to anyone about this manuscript at some point, but well worthy of reconstruction. This is that, these are leaves from that Gregory the Great mid-12th century manuscript I was telling you about. Tragic that this one was broken because we know which monastery this came from. It's Chiaravelle de Santa Colomba up near Milan. It was a foundation of roughly 1136, I think. And so possibly if this manuscript was actually made at that monastery, it would represent a period of early manuscript production at that monastery. If it was made there again, we just don't know. I'm very excited to report, though, that last Friday, I got an email from Ernst Bjarke, who's the curator at the Oslo Cathedral School. And he had seen the My Favorite Manuscript podcast that I did with Dodd Porter earlier this year. And he heard me mention Bruce Ferrini. So he got in touch to tell me about a handful of Ferrini manuscripts that they've got. And I was happy to hear him say that the Oslo Cathedral School has 57 folios of this. So Bill, we're going to be approaching you about doing a fragmentarium reconstruction of this, because between our two sets, we've got the majority of this manuscript now. So that one will be mostly recoverable. The anathema leaf for this, which is a key awesome leaf, that's at the Beinecke Library too, as part of the Takamiya collection. So there's some real kind of reconstruction we can do on this. This is just a lovely pocket Bible, Dominicans, full of notes, great illuminations, but just giving you a sense of the scale of Ferrini's breaking and what we have at Ohio State. We've got 133 folios of that here. We've got about a dozen folios of this legal manuscript. While this does not compare in terms of illumination and things like that to something like the Hornby Cockerell Bible, Ferrini's breaking of this is also exceptionally tragic, in my opinion, because this is an abridgment of one of the key canon law texts of the Middle Ages. And likely, it's a very small format thing. It likely was a personal, like a lawyer's personal copy and adaptation and abridgment of this for his specific use. So destruction of manuscripts like this prevents us from really learning kind of on the ground legal practice potentially during the Middle Ages. So not something that is going to command the prices that a Hornby Cockerell leaf would, but still very significant breaking, in my opinion. Then leaves from the so-called Glastonbury Bible. There's a huge chunk of this at the Oslo Cathedral School as well, 255 folios. Martin Skoyen recovered most of these as well. So Martin has done a fantastic job of helping undo a lot of Ferrini's breakings. And then we've got this interesting kind of portable Bible from Oxford, 66 folios, likely not at all associated with the de Brailles workshop, but anything during this period from Oxford that's illuminated at least helps us think about what that kind of situation of manuscript production in that town would have looked like then. This is widely dispersed. I would say I probably see 3 to 4 leaves of this for sale on eBay every year. So those are still kind of distributing out from whichever centers they're at now. So that kind of, this is not everything Ferrini gave us, but some of the, or not Ferrini, his business partners, but this gives you some sense of the large stock of Ferrini leaves that are sitting here at Ohio State waiting for reconstruction projects. The exhibition then turns to books of hours, the most breakable of manuscripts, I call them, because they're so full of color, decoration, and illumination. These are book breakers' dreams, basically. We've got a handful of examples of complete manuscripts here, some fragments. I'm going to focus in this section in telling you about this guy, though. It's the one on the far right. This is the Ursuline Hours of the Hours of the Ursulines of Brown County, a convent of nuns. And I'm focusing on this one because this is a story of fragmentation averted. So in December 2017, they contacted me and asked me to come down to the convent to look at this manuscript, because as the Mother Superior put it to me, were a group of aging nuns with very little diocesan support. And we're having to divest ourselves of a lot of our property. So she wanted to see what my thoughts were on this manuscript. I got down to the convent and she showed me an appraisal that they had gotten for this. They had approached a dealer who shall remain nameless right now at any rate. They approached this dealer for an appraisal. And as soon as I read this appraisal, it's like, this manuscript has not truly been assessed. It's been assessed for breaking. The entire appraisal was based on the 14 individual illuminated leaves you see like this that are present in this manuscript. And I told them this. I said, look, you guys are going to do what you need to do with this, but I want to tell you right now, if you sell based on this appraisal, I'm positive that there's a really good chance this is going to get broken apart. They started asking me about fragmentation then, because this hadn't even crossed their mind. They had no idea about the world of manuscript fragmentation. I wound up spending the entire day there, let them know that this was going to be out of the reach of Ohio State to be able to purchase, but that if they could hold on to it and wait, I'd be looking for some donor possibilities. I'm about to leave, I'm getting in the car, and the Mother Superior comes out with the manuscript wrapped in a cloth. And she says, I think this needs to go back to Columbus with you. Ohio State sounds like the home, and you're the person to caretake this for us during that process. So I wound up getting it up to Ohio State, got it in the vault, not knowing what we're going to do, knowing the nuns needed some money. And then, as the Mother Superior would say, God provides. A week later, a woman calls me out of the blue. She had been at a lecture I'd given about 4 years before on the Camino de Santiago in my pilgrimage across Spain. And she said, I've been thinking about that talk that you gave, and I want to buy you manuscripts. And that's really exciting to hear, but also infuriating because you don't know, is this $500? Is it 500,000? What's the expectation here? So I brought her in the following week, took her on a tour of rare books and manuscripts. We wound up in the vault, and I had no idea exactly what she was interested in, but during the course of our conversation, it became very clear that this was the book for her. I brought it out, told her the story of the nuns, talked a little bit about the manuscript, which I didn't know a whole lot about at that point. And at the end of the conversation, she agreed to buy it on our behalf. So within a month or so of me coming back with this manuscript, we had figured out its ultimate disposition. We agreed on a price, purchased it, we wound up getting it, and I started working on it. I'm going to have an article coming out on this sometime soon, I hope, but it's turned out to be a pretty fun manuscript. So you can see in the image on the left-hand side of the screen, there's actually a coat of arms here, and that coat of arms is very distinctive and very identifiable. This is a manuscript that was commissioned by Jean Mollet. And Jean Mollet, there may be people in here who are familiar with him because he's a known book commissioner. He and his brother Claude commissioned quite a few illuminated manuscripts in late 15th century France. They were getting their books from Lyon, from local production in Troyes, and then also from Paris. Now, it appears that Jean Mollet likely had this book commissioned for his wife because all of the Marian prayers, for instance, the appropriate ones preserve all of the feminine endings. There's a little clutch of old French prayers at the back that are traditionally associated with pregnancy and childbirth, etc. So it's been really, really nice to rescue a book that has marked medieval provenance that we can actually trace here. But another significant thing about this, and I use this a lot in classes as a demonstrator to students, that medieval manuscripts persist in having an active life long past their moment of creation or their ownership by the first person who used it. And this book came to the nuns by bequest or donation. It was given to them by John Quinlan, who was the Bishop of Mobile, Alabama. He gave it to them in 1870, and this makes it perhaps the longest tenured medieval manuscript in the state of Ohio. So that's kind of cool. I can't prove that, but it's definitely one of the longest. And the reason I bring up this recent provenance history is that Bishop Quinlan, and there's no way to verify this, but I've looked through a lot of the archival records about Quinlan's episcopate that are available down in the diocesan archives. And Quinlan owned this book during the American Civil War. And there are accounts from the Civil War of Quinlan roaming battlefields in the American South after the battle was over, ministering to the dead and the dying, quote, with a painted leather prayer book. And so this might be this book of hours, who knows? And I just find that very, very compelling to think about. We have a manuscript in our collections that we can trace back to its production in the third quarter of or fourth quarter of the 15th century, and know who owned it, who used it, but then also potentially see this as an object of devotion and worship and religious veneration on the battlefields of the American Civil War. And I love that about medieval manuscripts. If they survive to us today, they all have deeply complex and vibrant histories of reuse, reuse, and retasking over the centuries. The rest of this book of hours area is just kind of this collage of manuscript leaves, just to give folks a sense of different formats, different types of illustration, things like that. A handful of leaves here are relatively recent acquisitions. We've got the famous Chester Beatty hours in the middle there, and a couple other random illuminated pieces. So this just gives folks a sense of kind of the variety in books of hours over time. And then the very last case is one I just call carcasses. And one of the things that I do, because we are so active on the teaching front with medieval manuscripts here, is it doesn't matter how small, ratty, or incomplete something is, there's teaching value for us here. And this case is full of things that I originally acquired to provide students with low-risk pass-around pieces where we're not worried if the binding breaks, if a fragment falls on the ground, things like that. So we've got things like this giant choir book binding and a whole bunch of fragmentary leaves there. On the walls, you'll see the residue of cutting efforts. The majority of the loose cuttings that you see here, I quite literally acquired from a dealer for the cost of $20. He was going to throw them away. And I brought them back with me in the trash bag that he had used to package these up. And it's like, we can get value from this. And then the last guy I'm really going to feature is this empty book binding that I acquired maybe about 10 years ago, really just as a pass around, so I could pass it around class to my students so they could see how a book binding functioned. You know, you can see the cords, all of that stuff. And then I was getting ready for teaching the course again. This was maybe 5-6 years ago. I was getting ready to teach it again in the fall. And I took a closer look at this and it's like, well, let me see if I can activate this in a better, deeper way. And let's see what we can find out about this manuscript. Whether we can confirm it or not is anyone's guess, but let's see what we can use as conversational prompts in class. So I started looking at the outside, and if you just look at the blind tool patterning, this immediately suggests German. Or the German orbit, German speaking orbit, at least. There are other features that are distinctive, but that kind of is a nice talking point for students where you're letting them know, like, don't overlook any feature in a manuscript. But going in from the outside, okay, thinking it's German, let's flip it over and take a look. Okay, if you look at that paleography in the bottom right there, I think we're pretty certainly in the German orbit here, even though we're looking at Latin, etc. But if you actually read this text, this is text related to the hour of Compline. And if you look at the obscured rubrication up at the top, that is also citing Compline. So, and this is a small format binding. So right away, I think we're in pretty secure grounds that we're looking at a German manuscript, and it was likely a book of hours or a breviary. So we're getting a little bit closer here. Now, the thing that is obscuring the rubric at the top there is a chain scar. It's a staple scar for a chain binding. Now, I'm sure that there's an example out there somewhere, but I'm not personally that familiar with chained books of hours. However, I have seen chained breviaries where they'd be chained in place at an altar or on a wall, in a wall sconce, things like that. So that allows us now to, not with absolute precision, but with some degree of confidence, say, okay, we're looking at a German manuscript and a breviary, and it was in an institutional collection at some point in its history. If you go to the left, you then have 19th century provenance information that links this to the famous library of Friedrich Gottlieb Julius von Bülow, who died in 1836. And he was a monstrously successful book collector, but not a monstrously successful fiscal manager. What little I know of him, he bought books until he impoverished himself, and then almost immediately after his death, these books wind up getting sold at public auction. Luckily for me, Google Books exists. And that auction catalog has been digitized. And following the traces here, we get a strong suggestion, if not an outright confirmation, that the presumably breviary that was in this manuscript was once housed at the Dominican convent in Erfurt, Germany, because the auction catalog preserves information about this particular manuscript. So what I had originally bought as a trash salvation has really become kind of a provenance research treasure in terms of modeling for my students. The types of questions you can ask about even the barest and smallest and grottiest of fragments. So that kind of concludes my exhibition proper, but one thing I also wanted to bring up here was the bonus case that my colleague Pasha Johnson, Mary Ellen Pasha Johnson, has done. She's our curator for the Hillendar Research Library in Medieval Slavic Manuscripts on microfilm, but they also have a collection of codices and fragments. And in association with my exhibit, she put out a case in our common display area that highlights some of the fragment riches in our Eastern European collection. And we've got the top left there is a Ferrini breaking. Just to the right of that is an Otto Ege breaking. And then down in the bottom left corner is a 14th century Greek fragment that, so far as we know, is not related at all to either Ege or Ferrini, but is an other fragment there. So I realize I've given you kind of a rambling, very quick overview of the tour. All told, there are about 140, I think 139 exactly objects in it. It's just the tip of the iceberg for what we have at Ohio State. And I wasn't able to tell the story of everything, but it gives you a sense of what's here. If you find yourself in Central Ohio between now and August 6th, please do come in to have a look at this. Let me know if you're coming, and you will be welcome to have a look at everything else we've got down in the vault too. So thank you very much for attending.
Well, thank you, Professor Johnson, for a lot of fun and fascinating presentation. We are now going to open the floor to questions. And we already have one from Peter Kidd, who says, great talk. Is there a catalog of the show? And if not, have you thought of making a PDF available comprising images of the exhibits and their label texts?
Yes, I'm glad you asked. So Ohio State does not have an exhibits catalog budget. However, I've gotten this question a lot since day one of this, and I will be producing at the very least a PDF, and a pretty ambitious PDF catalog of this that will incorporate all of the text and images of everything, including like full case views, full wall views, but then individual images of every item. Once I've got that set up, I'm friends with the head of OSU Press here, and I'll throw it his way and just see if in principle it's something he thinks OSU Press might be interested in doing, and we'll go from there. But at the very least, by the end of this year, if not sometime in early fall, I'm hoping to have my kind of homemade PDF version of it ready. And I'll make sure you get a copy, Peter.
I mean, there's a lot to digest here. And one issue that keeps recurring here is the terminology that we use to refer to fragments. And you're using, licit and illicit. And how, so one question is really, how licit is it to speak of illicit fragments? And for that matter, carcasses or donors, or what do we, what's your feeling on our need for terminology here?
Well, I mean, this is an area that I would happily cede to Peter Kidd. He and I have talked about this, and Peter's talked a lot, both vocally and elsewhere, about the real need for a nomenclature, standardized nomenclature for fragments. Like, what are we calling a fragment? Like, a binding fragment is different than a so-called illicit leaf that is intact. Then you have cuttings and clippings, and there are endless versions of what a fragment is. And I think that there is some confusion there. I use licit and illicit in a very problematic way, I know, because it's like, how exactly do you define each? Like, that's going to be a shifting scale for everyone. So I think like Ege is very much, all of his manuscripts are the product of illicit fragmentation. However, most of that fragmentation was done at least 60 years ago, 70 years ago. If not longer at this point, and there is absolutely no way to undo that damage. So do we avoid working with or collecting those things, reconstructing them, because they were the product of deliberate book breaking? I think the answer is no, we don't avoid that. However, where the problem then comes in is you can easily apply that same rationale if you wanted to be a really bad devil's advocate and say, okay, well, there are endless people on eBay who buy codices, cheap codices at auction, and then cut them up, put them on sale the next day. Should we be buying those to reconstruct and preserve those? And it's like, so I think, you know, Lisa and Peter and other people out there may have a better way of putting this, but I think it's we really need to think carefully about, you know, who exactly is benefiting from this. Otto Ege and his heirs are not benefiting from the sale of these manuscripts, of his manuscripts now. So is it a question of we just want to make sure that the first breaker doesn't make money off of it? Or is it the second breaker doesn't make, or the second generation doesn't make money off of it, or the third? And so we talk about this in that panel discussion with RBS a little bit, if you want a more sustained conversation with it. But I have to say, as a curator who has very actively grown Ohio State's collection of codices and fragments, provenance and kind of the licitness or illicitness of fragmentation is a huge thing that I am always struggling with and need to justify.
Okay. We have a question from Deborah Lacoste, who says, it's absolutely fascinating. I'm so glad I came. How much of your fragment collection has music chant notation?
If you email me, I can get you very precise numbers, but quite a bit of it does.
Well, I see that our hour is up. So thank you, Eric, for spending the time to present this fascinating exhibition. So thank you all for coming, and we'll have another Fragmentarian video conference soon, and good luck. Bye.